Hello, my name is Alexander Solozhin. I'm an RA here at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. For our War Observatory project, we are conducting a series of interviews with experts in various academic fields relevant to the war in Ukraine. In this series, we cover basic and advanced subject matters relevant to the war. We intend for these videos to be used as teaching materials for faculty and students in Canada and around the world. Joining me here today to answer a few questions regarding the war in Ukraine is Dr. Paul Good. Dr. Paul Good is an associate professor and Macmillan Chair of Russian Studies at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. His current research broadly focuses on nationalism and authoritarianism in Russia and the former Soviet states. Professor Good is editor-in-chief of Communist and Post-Communist Studies and associate editor of Nationalities Papers. He also serves on the editorial boards for Russian Politics and Social Science Quarterly, and the advisory board for Nations and Nationalism. He is a long-standing member of the program committee and the advisory board for the Association for the Study of Nationalities. So we'll start with the basic questions. So what events led up to the invasion of Ukraine?
So the way that you answer this question kind of depends upon your historical view. One could start with 2021, one could start with 1991, one could start back with the Treaty of Pereslav. I'm going to start with 2021. In terms of proximate events that led up to the war, there was a buildup. Russia started to build up its military along the border with Ukraine in the spring of 2021. It wasn't entirely clear what the trigger was for this, although some have pointed to a trigger in the form of the crackdown within Ukraine on the oligarch Viktor Medvedchuk in February of 2021. Now, Medvedchuk has close ties with Putin, and he was an opposition voice within Ukrainian politics for Russian interests. He was later charged with treason and accused of plotting a military coup with Russia's help in Ukraine. His television channels, which were very influential, were seized, as well as his assets in Ukraine. And afterwards, after Medvedchuk was arrested, and accused of treason, that's when Russia began massing troops along the border and this continued through the spring of 2021. Now, Russia claimed that its troops were only there in the event that Ukraine attacked the separatist Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. But NATO then also began holding exercises within its own territories, its own country member states' territories in the spring. And so you had sort of like simultaneous buildup both of NATO forces within Eastern Europe, as well as forces from Russia along the border with Ukraine, and of course, rising tension in both sides. Now, there was also rising neo-imperial rhetoric about Ukraine coming from Russia, and this really escalated in the summer of 2021. In particular, in July of 2021, Putin published a now infamous op-ed on the history of Ukraine and Russia. And the essay essentially laid out the thesis that Ukraine's sovereignty is a historical injustice for Russia, that Ukrainian nationhood is a political illusion. Now, this wasn't anything that Putin hadn't said before, but it was a codified way of presenting, this kind of position. It marked a further escalation, not just in rhetoric, but in tensions between Russia and Ukraine. And it also then led other officials within Russia to follow suit in publishing their own sorts of op-eds and columns, right? And so you saw this hardening of elite opinion within Russia against Ukraine and the public circulation, public airing of grievances. The third phase that led to then the war was really from December 2021 onwards, when Russia and the United States agreed to hold negotiations to try to diffuse tensions. Now, Russia demanded written guarantees that Ukraine would never join NATO, but they also demanded a withdrawal of US forces from Europe and a rollback of NATO to its force posture from 1997 before the expansion of NATO. Now, most observers felt that the sweep of these demands were such that they were never really intended to succeed, that they were never serious negotiation points. This was essentially Putin declaring openly his dissatisfaction with the post-Cold War world order and his intent to roll it back, right, to challenge it. And by January, we now know that the United States was warning Ukraine and really the rest of Europe that a Russian attack was imminent. And then finally, in February of 2021, Russia moved unilaterally to recognize the two separatist republics in Ukraine, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, and it immediately moved its troops into those territories. This was actually the start of Russia's invasion, the second invasion by Russia of Ukraine. The first one was in 2014, right? And then on February 24th, the full war actually began, insofar as Putin then went on Russian television and announced the start of the so-called special military operation, which was aimed at what he called the denazification and the demilitarization of Ukraine. So that was February 24th, 2022, when the war actually began, after the invasion was already well underway.
So you've mentioned the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. So what are they and how were they formed?
So, okay, in a nutshell, these are puppet regimes that are controlled by Russia. When Russia first invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea in 2014, it also supported efforts to occupy and to claim Ukrainian territory elsewhere in Ukraine, including in the Donbas region. And this led to the declaration of the so-called People's Republics within the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, which are located in eastern Ukraine. The idea here was, initially these were just a sliver of territories within these larger regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. But they were led by activists, some of whom were Russian citizens, some of whom were locals that tend to be, of Russian ethnicity. But they were activists that were attempting to essentially launch what they called a Russian spring, and that this tied into the way that Putin framed the annexation of Crimea as sort of a revitalization of the Tsarist era territories of Novorossiya. Now, this changed over time, and the activists gradually fell out of favor with the Kremlin because, in part, they were not so easy to control. One of the things that was really sort of a crucial moment in this was the downing of the Malaysian airliner MH17 over Ukraine, which clearly was shot down by separatists located in these territories, but were not obviously very well controlled, much less trained by Russia. By the following year, by 2015, other attempts to establish similar separatist republics had either been repelled by the Ukrainian army or they'd been fizzled out. And as a result, then by 2015 onwards, essentially you had an effort to retake the territories by Ukraine that were then repelled with direct assistance of the Russian military that culminated then in the freezing of those territorial lines around these slivers, these separatist republics, for 8 years. They were bound up in this process that was known as the Minsk process or the Minsk Accords, an attempt to reconcile differences between Russia and Ukraine and to resolve what the status of these territories would be. It is in defense of the People's Republics that Russia has, putatively invaded Ukraine now, even though its attacks and the invasion itself go much, much wider than these two separatist republics. And it should be added that now those republics' territories have enlarged from just those initial slivers now to the entire regions of, the entire region of Luhansk. And at the time of this interview, it is growing throughout Donetsk. But this is coming very much behind the lines, led by Russian military and by forces fighting within those separatist republics on their behalf.